The blood-red sunset cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Redemption Springs as Rhett Calloway dismounted his exhausted stallion, every muscle in his body aching from the 3-day hard ride. 5 years away had changed nothing and everything about this Arizona Territory town. The same weathered buildings lined the street, but the weight of what he'd left behind hung heavier than the 6-shooter on his hip. Somewhere in this town, Violet Harmon was living under the cruel hand of Nathaniel Blackwood, and Rhett had returned to claim what he'd foolishly abandoned. Rhett looped his horse's reins around the hitching post outside the saloon, his spurs jingling softly as his boots hit the packed dirt. Dust clung to his trail-worn clothes, and the stubble on his jaw had grown past respectable into the territory of a man who'd ridden too hard with too little rest. None of that mattered now. He'd crossed 2 territories to get here after receiving that letter from Doc Miller describing what had become of Violet in his absence. The saloon doors swung open, releasing the sounds of a tinny piano and boisterous laughter. Rhett squared his shoulders and stepped inside, eyes scanning the dim interior. The piano player faltered as conversations died away. Familiar faces turned toward him, recognition followed by surprise flickering across weather-beaten features. "Well, I'll be damned," muttered Silas Jenkins from behind the bar, setting down the glass he'd been polishing. "Rhett Calloway back from the dead." Rhett approached the bar, his path clearing as men stepped aside. "Not dead, Silas, just been away." "Mighty long time to be away," Silas replied, pouring whiskey without being asked. "What brings you back to these parts?" Rhett's fingers wrapped around the glass. "Heard some news that concerned me." "About Miss Violet, I reckon." Silas lowered his voice. "Figured that might bring you running." "What can you tell me about Blackwood?" Rhett asked, keeping his voice level despite the rage simmering beneath his calm exterior. "Mean as a rattler with a toothache and twice as dangerous," Silas said, leaning closer. "Came to town about 3 years back. Bought up the old Henderson place, then the Mercantile, then half the businesses on this street. Made himself indispensable, then made himself the law. And Violet," the name caught in Rhett's throat, Silas's expression darkened, "married her last spring. Wasn't much of a choice for her after her pa died owing Blackwood money. She lives out at the Henderson place now." He paused, glancing around before continuing. "She ain't been seen much in town lately. When she does come in, she keeps her eyes down and her sleeves long, if you take my meaning." The whiskey burned Rhett's throat as he swallowed it in one motion. "I take your meaning clear enough. You planning on causing trouble, Rhett, because Blackwood's got men all over town, paid gunslingers, not local boys." "I'm not looking for trouble," Rhett replied, placing his empty glass on the bar. "Just looking to right a wrong I made a long time ago." Silas refilled his glass. "That wrong being leaving Violet behind, that'd be the one." Rhett's voice was rough with regret. "You should know," Silas continued, "folks say Blackwood's looking to expand his territory. Word is he's forcing small ranchers to sell out. Those that refuse have been having accidents. Sounds like the kind of man who needs to be stopped," Rhett observed quietly. "Maybe so, but not by one man alone," Silas warned. "Even a man with your reputation." Rhett had earned that reputation reluctantly. After leaving Redemption Springs, he drifted, taking work as a hired gun when necessary. His fast draw and steady aim had made him both respected and feared throughout the territories, but he'd never found satisfaction in violence. Every gunfight had left him feeling emptier, further from the man Violet had once loved. "I'll keep that in mind," Rhett said. "I need a room, Silas." "Somewhere quiet. Got one at the back. $2 a night." Rhett placed the coins on the counter. "I'll take it for a week to start." After securing his room and seeing to his horse, Rhett stood at the window, watching as darkness settled over the town. In the distance, he could make out the silhouette of the Henderson place on the hill outside town. Somewhere in that house, Violet was enduring a life he had inadvertently condemned her to by leaving. His mind drifted back to that last night together, the promises they'd made under a canopy of stars. He'd been 22, she 19, both full of dreams bigger than Redemption Springs could hold. He'd promised to make his fortune and return for her. She'd promised to wait. But life had other plans, and his letters had gone unanswered after the first year. Eventually, he'd stopped writing, assuming she'd moved on. Never had he imagined this outcome. Sleep came fitfully that night, haunted by memories of Violet's smile and imaginings of her suffering. By dawn, Rhett had formed the beginnings of a plan. He couldn't simply confront Blackwood, not with Violet's safety at stake. He needed information, allies, and time. The morning brought a clearer view of what Redemption Springs had become under Blackwood's influence. From his vantage point on the saloon's balcony, Rhett observed men he recognized as hired guns positioned strategically throughout town. The mercantile's storefront had been expanded, now bearing the name Blackwood Goods in fresh paint. The bank, too, displayed Blackwood's name prominently. Rhett made his way to Doc Miller's office, hoping the old physician might provide more insight. The bell above the door jingled as he entered, and the gray-haired doctor looked up from his desk, spectacles perched on his nose. "Rhett Calloway," Doc Miller said, rising slowly. "I wasn't sure my letter would find you." "It almost didn't," Rhett admitted, closing the door behind him. "I was heading north when it caught up to me in Santa Fe, and you came straight back." It wasn't a question. Doc Miller gestured to a chair. "Sit, you look like you've barely rested." Rhett sat, removing his hat. "Your letter was concerning. Tell me everything, Doc." The old physician sighed heavily. "Edward Harmon, Violet's father, began borrowing from Blackwood after the drought 2 years ago. The ranch was failing, and Edward was desperate. By the time he realized the trap he'd fallen into, it was too late. The interest on the loans was impossible to pay. And Blackwood offered a solution," Rhett surmised grimly. "Violet in exchange for the debt," Doc confirmed. "Edward refused initially, but then he took ill, pneumonia. On his deathbed, he agreed to the arrangement, thinking it would secure Violet's future." "Some future," Rhett muttered. "Indeed." Doc Miller removed his spectacles, polishing them absently. The bruises started appearing within a month of the wedding. "Violet would come to me with some story about falling or walking into a door. I pretended to believe her because she was terrified. But lately—" He trailed off, his expression troubled. "What, Doc?" "She hasn't been to see me in over 2 months, but one of Blackwood's ranch hands came in last week with a broken arm. He let slip that Mrs. Blackwood was having a difficult time." Doc Miller's eyes met Rhett's. "I fear for her life, Rhett." Rhett's hands tightened into fists. "I need to see her." "Talk to her?" "That won't be easy. Blackwood keeps her isolated at the ranch. She's allowed into town only for church on Sundays, and even then she's accompanied by one of his men." "Tomorrow's Sunday," Rhett noted. "I'll be there." "Be careful," Doc warned. "Blackwood is paranoid and violent. If he suspects your intentions—" "I know how to be discreet," Rhett assured him, though patience had never been his strong suit. "What else can you tell me about his operation? Sila's mentioned he's forcing ranchers out." Doc nodded grimly. "Started about 6 months ago. Small places first, offering prices well below value. Those who refused suffered mysterious cattle deaths, broken fences, dried up wells. 3 ranches have burned to the ground, supposedly from lightning strikes. In a drought." "Exactly." Doc leaned forward. "There's more. Blackwood's been meeting with representatives from the railroad. Word is he's brokered a deal to have the new line come through Redemption Springs right through land he now controls." "So that's his game," Rhett mused. "Buy cheap, sell dear to the railroad. And become one of the wealthiest men in the territory in the process." Rhett stood, placing his hat back on his head. "Thanks, Doc. I'll be in touch." "What are you planning, Rhett?" "Better you don't know just yet," Rhett replied, "but I intend to free Violet from that monster." "And then what?" Doc asked. "Blackwood isn't a man who forgives or forgets." Rhett's expression hardened. "Neither am I." The remainder of the day was spent reconnoitering. Rhett rode the outskirts of town, studying the approaches to the Henderson, now Blackwood Ranch, from a distance. The 2-story house sat on a rise overlooking the valley, with a clear view of anyone approaching. 2 men patrolled the grounds, rifles visible even from Rhett's position. The barn and outbuildings formed a rough semicircle behind the main house, with corrals holding fine horses, Blackwood's pride, according to local gossip. As dusk approached, Rhett returned to town, taking his evening meal at the small cafe across from the saloon. He listened more than he spoke, gathering snippets of conversation about Blackwood's operation, his men, his habits. By nightfall, he had confirmed that Blackwood rarely missed Sunday services, apparently enjoying the respectability church attendance provided. Sunday morning dawned clear and hot, promising another scorching day. Rhett dressed with unusual care, choosing his least trail-worn shirt and brushing his dark hair into submission. He arrived at the small white church early, taking a seat near the back where he could observe the entrance without being immediately visible. The congregation filed in slowly, nodding respectfully to Reverend Walsh at the door. Rhett's heart hammered against his ribs as he waited, scanning each face. Then, a stir at the entrance drew his attention. Nathaniel Blackwood entered first, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 40s, with silver threading through his dark hair and cold eyes that surveyed the congregation like a predator. His hand rested possessively on the arm of the woman who followed him. Rhett's breath caught in his throat. Violet was still beautiful, though thinner than he remembered, her delicate features accentuated by the hollows beneath her cheekbones. Her chestnut hair was pulled back severely, and her blue dress, though fine, covered her from neck to wrists despite the heat. But it was her eyes that caused Rhett physical pain. Once bright and full of life, they now seemed dimmed, fixed on the floor as she moved beside her husband. Blackwood led her to a pew near the front, positioning himself between Violet and the aisle. A bulky man who could only be one of his hired guns took a seat directly behind them. Rhett forced himself to breathe normally, to keep his face impassive despite the rage building inside him at the sight of Violet's subdued demeanor. The service passed in a blur, Reverend Walsh's sermon on forgiveness striking Rhett as ironic given his current thoughts. When the final hymn concluded, Rhett remained seated as the congregation began to disperse, watching as Blackwood escorted Violet toward the door, his hand firmly on her back. In the churchyard, Rhett positioned himself casually near a large oak tree, tipping his hat to passing townsfolk while keeping Violet in his peripheral vision. Blackwood had been waylaid by the mayor, and Violet stood slightly apart, her eyes still downcast, a parasol shielding her face from the sun. It was the only chance he might get. Rhett moved smoothly through the crowd, approaching from an angle that kept him obscured from Blackwood's view. He stopped beside Violet, not looking directly at her. "Miss Violet," he said softly, using the name he'd called her years ago. Her body tensed, but she didn't look up. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, barely moving her lips. "He'll kill you." "I came back for you," Rhett said, his voice low and urgent. "I'm not leaving without you." "It's too late," she replied, her voice breaking slightly. "Please, just go." "Violet, there you are, my dear." Blackwood's voice cut through their exchange as he approached, his smile not reaching his eyes. Making new acquaintances, Violet's face paled. Just exchanging pleasantries about the sermon, Nathaniel. Blackwood's gaze shifted to Rhett, eyes narrowing slightly. "I don't believe we've met, Mr. Ross," Rhett lied smoothly. "James Ross, just passing through on my way to Tucson." "Nathaniel Blackwood." The man extended his hand, his grip unnecessarily firm. "I own most of the businesses in town. If you're staying, you'll likely be spending your money in one of my establishments. Just here for a day or two," Rhett replied, matching Blackwood's grip. "Though I must say you're a fortunate man to have such a lovely wife." Something dangerous flashed in Blackwood's eyes. "Indeed I am. And quite protective of her, as any husband would be." He turned to Violet. "Come, my dear, we have guests arriving for lunch." Rhett watched as Blackwood led Violet away, noting how her shoulders hunched slightly when Blackwood's hand tightened on her arm. The bodyguard followed a few paces behind, casting a suspicious glance back at Rhett. "Dangerous game you're playing, Calloway." Rhett turned to find Sheriff Wilson standing beside him, his weathered face grim beneath his gray mustache. "Don't know what you mean, Sheriff," Rhett replied. "Cut the act. I've known you since you were knee-high to a grasshopper," Wilson said quietly. "Word travels fast in small towns, especially when a man with your reputation shows up after 5 years. My reputation's exaggerated. Maybe so, but Blackwood's isn't." Wilson adjusted his gun belt. "He's got the town council in his pocket and enough hired guns to start a small war. Whatever you're planning, think twice. I'm just here to right a wrong, Sheriff. That wrong being Violet, Wilson shook his head. She's a married woman now, Rhett, legally bound. To a man who beats her, Rhett countered, his voice hardening. You know it as well as I do, Wilson's expression tightened. What I know and what I can prove are different matters. I've tried to help, but without her testimony, so you do nothing. I do what I can within the law, Wilson replied sharply, which is more than I expect you're planning. Rhett remained silent, his jaw clenched. Wilson sighed. Look, I'm not blind to what's happening. Blackwood's building an empire through intimidation and violence, but he's careful. Never does his own dirty work, always has an alibi. He glanced around before continuing. If you're determined to help Violet, you need to be smarter than him, not faster with a gun. I'm open to suggestions, Sheriff. Wilson considered Rhett for a moment. Meet me at my office after dark. Use the back door. With that, the sheriff tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Rhett to ponder this unexpected potential ally. The remainder of the day stretched endlessly. Rhett returned to the saloon, pretending to drink while listening to conversations around him. By late afternoon, he'd learned that Blackwood's Sunday gatherings were notorious dinner parties where he showcased his wealth to potential business partners and intimidated local ranchers into considering his offers. As darkness fell, Rhett made his way discreetly to the sheriff's office, slipping through the back door as instructed. Wilson was waiting, a lamp turned low on his desk. Glad you came, the sheriff said, gesturing to a chair. I wasn't sure you would. Said I was open to suggestions, Rhett replied, taking the offered seat. Wilson leaned back in his chair. Been sheriff here for 22 years. Seen this town through drought, disease, and the occasional outlaw, never thought I'd see it fall to a man like Blackwood. He pulled out a flask, taking a swig before offering it to Rhett, who declined. When Edward Harmon died, Violet had no choice but to marry Blackwood. The ranch was mortgaged to the hilt, and she had nowhere else to go. She could have come to me, Rhett said, the words tasting bitter. Could she? Wilson raised an eyebrow. No one knew where you were, Rhett. You rode out 5 years ago chasing glory or fortune or whatever it was you thought you'd find. Can't blame the girl for thinking you weren't coming back. The truth of it stung, but Rhett couldn't deny it. What's done is done. I'm here now. Yes, you are, Wilson leaned forward. And I'm going to help you, but not because I approve of what you likely have in mind. I'm helping because Violet deserves better and because Blackwood's stranglehold on this town needs to end. What do you have in mind? Wilson pulled a folded paper from his desk drawer. This came by telegraph yesterday. Seems Blackwood's past is catching up with him. United States Marshal James Cooper is on his way here, investigating Blackwood for land fraud and possibly murder in Colorado territory. Rhett studied the telegram. When does he arrive? That's the problem. Not for another 2 weeks, and someone in the telegraph office must have tipped Blackwood off because he's accelerated his plans. Word is he's forcing the remaining holdouts to sign over their land by the end of the week. And Violet. Wilson's expression darkened. Doc Miller says she won't survive 2 more weeks of Blackwood's attention, not in her current state. What does that mean? Rhett demanded, a chill running through him. It means she's with child, Rhett, Blackwood's child. And he's not being gentle with her despite it. The news hit Rhett like a physical blow. Violet pregnant with another man's child, Blackwood's child. For a moment, jealousy flared hot and bright, but it was quickly extinguished by concern for her safety. All the more reason to get her away from him, Rhett said firmly. Agreed, Wilson nodded. But we need to be smart about this. Blackwood has eyes everywhere. If he suspects you're here for Violet, he'll either kill you outright or use her as leverage. So what's the plan? Wilson smiled grimly. How do you feel about becoming a wealthy cattle buyer from Texas? The following morning, Rhett emerged from the general store transformed. Gone were his trail-worn clothes, replaced by a tailored black suit, crisp white shirt, and polished boots. A gold watch chain hung across his vest, and his usual weathered hat had been exchanged for a new black Stetson. Only his gun belt remained, though it now held a more ornate Colt in a tooled leather holster. Sheriff Wilson was waiting across the street, nodding approval at Rhett's appearance. Looking the part, I see. Feels strange, Rhett admitted, adjusting his collar. Been a long time since I dressed like this. Well, Richard Travis of the Double T Ranch in Texas doesn't wear trail dust, Wilson reminded him, using the identity they'd created. He wears success. Let's hope Blackwood takes the bait, Rhett said. He will. I sent word through Mayor Evans this morning that a wealthy cattle buyer is looking to expand into Arizona territory. Blackwood never misses an opportunity for profit. Their plan was simple but risky. Rhett, posing as Richard Travis, would express interest in purchasing large tracts of land for a cattle operation. This would give him legitimate reason to visit Blackwood's ranch and potentially gain access to Violet. Meanwhile, Sheriff Wilson would quietly prepare a small group of trusted men to assist with Violet's escape once an opportunity presented itself. Remember, Wilson cautioned, Blackwood is no fool. He didn't get where he is by being careless. You'll need to convince him completely. I know how to play a part, Rhett assured him, though anxiety gnawed at his insides. One slip, one moment of recognition from Violet at the wrong time, and everything could fall apart. The invitation came faster than they'd anticipated. By noon, a messenger delivered a note to Rhett at the saloon, requesting his presence at the Blackwood Ranch for dinner that evening. The speed of the response confirmed Wilson's assessment. Blackwood was accelerating his plans and seeking new investors urgently. As dusk approached, Rhett rode toward the Henderson Ranch, now flying Blackwood's flag at the entrance. Two armed men stopped him at the gate, checking his invitation before allowing him to proceed up the long drive to the main house. The building he remembered as a modest ranch home had been expanded and embellished with a wraparound porch and ornate trim, a visible testament to Blackwood's wealth and ambition. A stable hand took his horse, and Rhett ascended the porch steps, straightening his jacket. The door opened before he could knock, revealing a stern-faced housemaid who led him through the foyer into a spacious parlor where several guests already mingled. Blackwood dominated the room, holding court near the fireplace. He spotted Rhett immediately, excusing himself from his conversation to approach. Mr. Travis, he greeted, extending his hand. A pleasure to have you join us. I understand you're interested in establishing a presence in our territory. The pleasure's mine, Mr. Blackwood, Rhett replied, adopting a slight Texan drawl. And yes, the Double T is looking to expand. Arizona territory seems promising. Indeed it is, especially with the railroad coming through. Blackwood's smile was calculating. Allow me to introduce you to some of our local businessmen. For the next half hour, Rhett circulated through the room, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries while scanning discreetly for any sign of Violet. He maintained his character flawlessly, discussing cattle prices and grazing rights with the ease of someone who had indeed built a ranching empire in Texas. Finally, as dinner was announced, the parlor doors opened and Violet appeared. She wore a dark green dress that accentuated her pale complexion, her hair arranged elegantly atop her head. Even from across the room, Rhett could see the strain in her features, the careful way she held herself as though every movement caused discomfort. Blackwood moved to her side immediately, his possessive hand on her waist. My dear, allow me to present Mr. Richard Travis from Texas. Mr. Travis, my wife Violet. Rhett bowed slightly, taking her gloved hand and pressing it briefly to his lips. Mrs. Blackwood, a pleasure. Their eyes met for the briefest moment. Recognition flickered in her gaze, followed by shock and fear. To her credit, her expression remained composed, though her hand trembled slightly in his. Welcome to our home, Mr. Travis, she said softly, her voice steadier than Rhett had expected. I hope you find Redemption Springs to your liking. It has certainly made an impression already, Rhett replied, releasing her hand reluctantly. Dinner was an elaborate affair, with Blackwood seated at the head of the table and Violet at the opposite end. Rhett found himself positioned midway down, between the mayor's wife and a rancher named Peterson whose property adjoined the Blackwood estate. Throughout the meal, Rhett maintained his character while observing the dynamics of the household. Blackwood controlled the conversation, interrupting Violet whenever she spoke more than a few words. The servants moved silently, clearly fearful of their employer. Most telling was how Violet ate little, wincing occasionally when she shifted in her chair. As the meal concluded, Blackwood invited the male guests to join him for brandy and cigars in his study. Rhett followed, continuing his charade while mentally mapping the house's layout. The study revealed much about Blackwood. Maps of the territory lined one wall, with properties marked in red ink. A large safe stood in the corner, and a display case held an impressive collection of firearms. "So, Mr. Travis," Blackwood said once they were settled with brandy, "what exactly brings you to our little corner of the territory? Surely Texas offers ample opportunity for a man of your means." "Diversification, Mr. Blackwood," Rhett replied smoothly. "The wise businessman doesn't keep all his cattle in one corral, so to speak. The coming railroad makes this area particularly attractive." "Perceptive," Blackwood nodded appreciatively. "I've acquired significant holdings along the projected route myself, so I've heard. In fact, I'd be interested in discussing the possibility of purchasing some of that land if you're amenable." Blackwood studied him over the rim of his glass. "Perhaps. Though I'm quite selective about who I do business with." "As am I," Rhett countered. "I prefer to inspect potential acquisitions thoroughly before committing. Perhaps tomorrow you might show me some of these properties?" "I could arrange that," Blackwood agreed. "Though I must warn you, the terrain is rough, not like your Texas flatlands." "I've ridden worse," Rhett assured him. The conversation shifted to other topics, but Rhett had achieved his first objective, securing another invitation to the ranch. As the evening wore on, he kept track of Violet's whereabouts through the open door. She moved among the female guests in the parlor, the perfect hostess despite her obvious discomfort. Not once did she glance in the direction of the study, maintaining a careful distance from her husband's domain. When the gathering finally broke up near midnight, Rhett thanked Blackwood for his hospitality, confirming their arrangement to tour the properties the following day. As he collected his hat from the maid, he caught a glimpse of Violet ascending the staircase slowly, one hand on the banister for support. The sight strengthened his resolve to move quickly. The ride back to town gave Rhett time to organize his thoughts. The ranch was well guarded, with men patrolling regularly. The house itself presented challenges. Violet's bedroom was likely on the upper floor, possibly shared with Blackwood. Any attempt to reach her there would be dangerous. Tomorrow's excursion might provide better opportunities, but also carried significant risks. Sheriff Wilson was waiting in Rhett's room at the saloon, his expression eager for news. "How did it go?" he asked as Rhett removed his jacket. "About as expected," Rhett replied, pouring 2 glasses of whiskey from the bottle on the dresser. "Blackwood took the bait. I'm to tour his properties tomorrow. And Violet," Rhett's jaw tightened. "She recognized me but didn't give anything away. She looks unwell, Wilson. Moves like she's in pain." Wilson accepted the offered whiskey with a grim nod. "Doc's been worried, says the pregnancy is difficult and Blackwood's attentions aren't helping. I'm getting her out tomorrow," Rhett stated flatly. "I won't leave her there another night. That's risky." "We haven't prepared. I don't care," Rhett cut him off. "She won't survive much longer in that house. I saw it in her eyes." Wilson sighed heavily. "What's your plan?" "Blackwood's taking me to see properties tomorrow. With luck, we'll be away from the ranch, giving me a chance to assess the layout more carefully. If I can get a message to Violet, arrange a meeting point. And if Blackwood doesn't leave her side or posts guards, then I'll improvise," Rhett said grimly. "One way or another, she's leaving with me tomorrow." Wilson studied him for a long moment. "You still love her, don't you? Even after all this time, even knowing she's carrying another man's child." "I never stopped loving her," Rhett admitted. "Leaving was the biggest mistake of my life. I intend to spend the rest of it making up for that if she'll have me. And if she won't, then I'll still get her to safety," Rhett said firmly. "Her happiness matters more than mine." Wilson nodded slowly. "All right, I'll have 3 men ready tomorrow night. There's an abandoned line shack about 5 miles north of town, near the creek. If you can get Violet there, we'll meet you with fresh horses and supplies." "Thank you, Sheriff." "Don't thank me yet," Wilson warned. "If this goes wrong, we could all hang for it. Blackwood has friends in high places." "It won't go wrong," Rhett insisted, though doubt gnawed at the edges of his confidence. "It can't." Morning came too slowly, each minute stretching as Rhett prepared for the day ahead. He dressed in his new clothes, but opted for more practical boots and secured a small derringer in an ankle holster, a precaution Wilson had suggested. His regular Colt remained at his hip, a familiar weight that provided some comfort as he rode toward the Blackwood ranch. The day was already hot, the sun beating down mercilessly as Rhett approached the ranch house. Blackwood was waiting on the porch, dressed for riding and flanked by two men Rhett recognized as his most trusted gun hands. "Mr. Travis," Blackwood called as Rhett dismounted. "Right on time." "I appreciate punctuality in business matters." "As do I," Rhett replied, shaking the offered hand. "I'm eager to see these properties you mentioned." "Of course." Blackwood gestured to the men beside him. "This is Jackson and Miller. They'll be accompanying us today. The terrain can be treacherous, and there have been reports of bandits in the area." The message was clear. Blackwood wasn't taking any chances with his new business associate. Rhett nodded politely to the gunmen, noting their watchful postures and the well-worn holsters that marked them as experienced fighters. "A wise precaution," Rhett agreed. "Shall we?" As they prepared to depart, the front door opened and Violet emerged. She wore a simple blue dress, her hair pulled back from her face, emphasizing the dark circles beneath her eyes. She carried a cloth-wrapped package which she handed to Blackwood. "I packed some food for your journey," she said, her voice soft but steady. The cook prepared cold chicken and biscuits. "How thoughtful," Blackwood replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. He passed the package to Jackson without looking at it. "We'll return by sunset, my dear. Remember what we discussed." "Yes, Nathaniel," she murmured, her eyes downcast. Rhett caught her gaze briefly as he tipped his hat. "Good day, Mrs. Blackwood." A barely perceptible nod was her only response, but it was enough. She had recognized him, and more importantly, she understood why he was there. The slight straightening of her shoulders told him she was ready, waiting for his signal. The four men rode out, Blackwood leading the way toward the eastern edge of his property. As they traveled, he pointed out boundaries and features, speaking of water rights and grazing quality with the expertise of someone who had studied the land thoroughly. Rhett listened attentively, asking appropriate questions while mentally calculating distances and identifying landmarks for the escape plan forming in his mind. By midday, they had covered significant ground, reaching a high ridge overlooking a vast valley. Blackwood dismounted, indicating that they would stop for the meal Violet had packed. As the men spread out slightly to rest their horses, Rhett seized the opportunity to separate Jackson from his saddle bags, casually engaging him in conversation about gun preferences while surreptitiously checking the contents. Among the expected items ammunition, tobacco, a flask, he found a small vial that confirmed his suspicions. Laudanum, potent enough to render a man unconscious if administered in sufficient quantity. The remainder of the afternoon passed in similar fashion, with Blackwood showcasing properties that would indeed be valuable once the railroad arrived. Throughout it all, Rhett maintained his persona, expressing interest and discussing potential prices while looking for any opportunity to separate from the group. None presented itself. Jackson and Miller remained vigilant, positioning themselves to keep both Rhett and the trail in view at all times. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Blackwood announced it was time to return to the ranch. Rhett's anxiety increased. He had yet to formulate a definitive plan for reaching Violet. The opportunity came unexpectedly as they approached a narrow pass between two rocky outcroppings. "This section of the property has excellent natural boundaries," Blackwood was saying as they rode single file through the pass. "Easily defensible, should that ever be a concern." "A valuable feature," Rhett agreed, noting how the path forced Jackson and Miller to fall behind them. Suddenly, Blackwood reined his horse to a stop, turning in the saddle to face Rhett. His expression had changed, the genial businessman replaced by something colder and more calculating. "You know, Mr. Travis," he said conversationally, "I pride myself on knowing every cattle operation in Texas. Strange that I've never heard of the Double T Ranch." Rhett's hand instinctively moved closer to his gun. "It's a relatively new venture, been building it up for about 3 years now." "Is that so?" Blackwood's smile didn't reach his eyes. Because I sent a telegram to a friend in Dallas last night, asking about you. His reply was most interesting. Rhett maintained his composure, aware that Jackson and Miller had now drawn closer, their hands hovering near their weapons. Business associates often have different perspectives. Indeed, but in this case the perspective was quite clear. Blackwood's voice hardened. There is no Richard Travis owning any significant ranch in Texas, so I find myself wondering, sir, exactly who you are and what your interest in my properties and perhaps my wife might be. The moment had come sooner than Rhett had anticipated, but there was no turning back now. He straightened in the saddle, dropping the Texan drawl. You're right about one thing, Blackwood, I'm not Richard Travis. Then who, pray tell, are you? The name's Rhett Calloway. I knew Violet before you forced her to marry you. Recognition dawned in Blackwood's eyes, followed by a cold fury. Calloway, the gunfighter who abandoned her, how interesting. He glanced at his men, and foolish. Did you really think you could ride onto my land, into my home, and I wouldn't discover your deception? I counted on it, Rhett replied calmly. Just as I'm counting on your arrogance right now. Blackwood's hand moved toward his gun, but Rhett was faster. In one fluid motion, he drew and fired, the bullet striking Blackwood's shoulder rather than his heart, a deliberate choice. Blackwood cried out, toppling from his horse as Jackson and Miller drew their weapons. What followed was the kind of gunfight Rhett had hoped to avoid. He dove from his saddle as bullets whizzed past, taking cover behind a boulder. Jackson was good but predictable, firing rapidly without proper aim. Miller was more methodical, waiting for a clear shot. Rhett picked his moments carefully, conserving ammunition while keeping both men pinned down. A bullet grazed Rhett's arm, tearing through his jacket and drawing blood. He ignored the burning pain, focusing instead on the increasingly desperate situation. Jackson had worked his way to a position with a better angle, while Miller was attempting to circle behind. Between them, Blackwood lay groaning on the ground, clutching his bleeding shoulder. Rhett made a swift decision. Holstering his Colt, he retrieved the derringer from his ankle and waited. When Jackson shifted position, exposing himself momentarily, Rhett fired his Colt twice in rapid succession. The first shot missed, but the second caught Jackson in the leg, sending him tumbling with a howl of pain. With Jackson temporarily incapacitated, Rhett turned his attention to Miller, who had used the distraction to close in from behind. Rhett spun just as Miller emerged from behind a rock formation, the derringer steady in his left hand. The small gun's report was almost lost in the echoes of the previous shots, but the bullet found its mark, striking Miller in the shoulder and spinning him to the ground. In the sudden silence, Rhett moved quickly, disarming both wounded men and securing them with their own belts and bandanas. Neither wound was life-threatening, but both would keep the men immobilized long enough for his purposes. Blackwood remained conscious, his face contorted with pain and rage as Rhett approached. "You're a dead man, Calloway," he snarled. "Even if you kill me, my associates will hunt you to the ends of the earth." "I'm not going to kill you, Blackwood," Rhett replied, kneeling beside him to check the wound. "That would be too easy. The bullet went clean through your shoulder. You'll live to face justice." "Justice?" Blackwood laughed bitterly. "There is no justice in this territory that I don't control." "We'll see about that." Rhett tore a strip from Blackwood's shirt, binding the wound tightly. "The U.S. Marshal arriving next week might have a different perspective on your business dealings." Surprise flickered across Blackwood's face. "How did you— You're not the only one with connections," Rhett interrupted, securing Blackwood's hands in front of him with a length of rope from his saddle bag. "Now, I'm going to collect Violet. If you're wise, you'll stay exactly where you are until the sheriff finds you." "She won't go with you," Blackwood said, his voice strained but confident. "She's carrying my child. She's my wife." "She was never yours," Rhett replied, mounting his horse. "You bought her, but you never owned her heart." Leaving the three men secured, Rhett rode hard for the Blackwood ranch, the setting sun casting long shadows across the landscape. His mind raced with contingency plans. There would still be men at the ranch, possibly more dangerous now without Blackwood to restrain them. The ranch appeared quiet as Rhett approached, but he knew appearances could be deceiving. He circled wide, approaching from the rear where the tree line provided cover. Tethering his horse in the shelter of the trees, he made his way cautiously toward the house, watching for any sign of guards. 2 men patrolled the grounds, their patterns regular and predictable. Rhett timed his movements carefully, slipping from shadow to shadow until he reached the back porch. The kitchen door was unlocked, a stroke of luck he hadn't counted on. Inside, the house was eerily silent, the dinner hour not yet arrived. Rhett moved through the kitchen into the main hallway, straining to hear any sound that might indicate Violet's location. A soft melody drifted down from upstairs. Someone was playing a piano. Following the sound, he ascended the stairs carefully, wincing as a board creaked beneath his weight. The music led him to a small sitting room adjacent to what he assumed was the master bedroom. There, seated at a small piano, was Violet. Her back was to the door, her fingers moving gracefully over the keys despite the melancholy tune she played. For a moment, Rhett simply watched her, struck by the memory of similar evenings years ago when she would play for him on her father's old piano. "Violet," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. The music stopped abruptly. She turned, her eyes widening with a mixture of hope and fear. "Rhett, where's Nathaniel?" "Indisposed," Rhett replied, moving into the room. "We don't have much time. Pack only what you absolutely need." "We're leaving." She rose unsteadily, one hand moving protectively to her slightly swollen belly. "He'll find us. He always says he'll find me if I try to leave." "Not this time," Rhett assured her, taking her hands in his. "Sheriff Wilson is helping us. There's a U.S. Marshal on his way to arrest Blackwood for crimes in Colorado. It's over." Violet, tears welled in her eyes. "I never thought. I'd given up hoping." "I know," Rhett said gently. "And I'm sorry I didn't come sooner, but we need to move quickly. Can you ride?" She nodded, wiping away tears. "Yes." "The doctor says the baby is strong despite everything." "Good. Gather your things while I check for guards." While Violet hastily packed a small bag, Rhett surveyed the grounds from the upstairs windows. The guards maintained their patrol, unaware that anything was amiss. In the distance, he could see a rider approaching, possibly one of Blackwood's men returning from town, or worse, coming with news of the confrontation. "We need to go now," he urged as Violet emerged from the bedroom with a carpet bag. "Is there a back way out that avoids the main staircase?" "The servants' stairs," she replied, leading him to a narrow door that opened onto a steep stairway. "They lead to the kitchen." They descended quickly, Rhett supporting Violet as she navigated the narrow steps. In the kitchen, he paused, peering through the window to check the positions of the guards. One was approaching the back of the house, his path taking him directly past their planned exit. "Wait here," Rhett whispered, drawing his Colt. Before Violet could protest, he slipped outside, staying close to the shadows of the porch. As the guard rounded the corner, Rhett struck quickly, the butt of his pistol connecting with the man's temple. The guard crumpled without a sound. Rhett dragged him beneath the porch, relieving him of his weapons before returning for Violet. "Stay close to me," he instructed as they moved across the open ground toward the tree line. "If anything happens, run for those trees. My horse is tethered about 50 yards in." They had covered half the distance when a shout rang out from the direction of the house. The second guard had spotted them. Gunfire erupted, bullets kicking up dirt at their feet. "Run." Rhett pushed Violet toward the trees, turning to provide covering fire. The guard took shelter behind a water trough, returning fire sporadically. Rhett's shots kept him pinned down, but the commotion had alerted others in the bunkhouse, who were now emerging with weapons drawn. Rhett backed toward the trees, firing carefully to conserve ammunition. A bullet tore through his sleeve, another grazed his thigh, but he remained upright, determined to reach Violet, who had disappeared into the tree line. Once among the trees, Rhett moved swiftly, following the path to where he'd left his horse. Violet was already there, her face pale but resolute. "Can you mount?" he asked, wincing as he tested his injured leg. "Yes," she replied, accepting his help to climb into the saddle. Rhett mounted behind her, wrapping one arm securely around her waist as he took the reins with his other hand. "Hold tight," he murmured, urging the horse forward. Behind them, shouts and gunfire indicated that Blackwood's men had reached the trees. Rhett pushed the horse harder, weaving through the dense forest where the larger group would have difficulty following. Night had fallen completely now, the darkness both a hindrance and an ally as they rode north toward the lined shack where Wilson would be waiting. Violet remained silent, her body tense against his chest. Only when they were several miles from the ranch did she finally speak. "I thought you were never coming back," she said, her voice barely audible above the horse's hoofbeats. "I should never have left," Rhett replied, his lips close to her ear. "Not a day went by that I didn't think of you. Your letters stopped coming." "I wrote for over a year," he told her. "When there was no reply, I assumed you'd moved on." She shook her head slightly. "Nathaniel, he must have intercepted them. He arrived in town not long after you left, started buying up properties, including my father's debts. I'm sorry, Violet, for everything you've endured." "It doesn't matter now," she said, though her voice betrayed the depth of her suffering. "We're together again, but Rhett, the baby, is innocent," he finished for her. "We'll raise the child as our own if you'll have me." She turned slightly in the saddle, looking up at him with wonder. "After everything, you would do that?" "I would do anything for you, Violet. I always would have." They rode in silence after that, each lost in thoughts of what had been lost and what might yet be gained. The night grew colder, and Rhett felt Violet shiver against him. He urged the horse faster, concerned for her condition after the stress of their escape. The line shack appeared as a dark silhouette against the starlit sky, a thin curl of smoke rising from its chimney indicating that Wilson had indeed prepared for their arrival. As they approached, two figures emerged from the shadows, rifles raised cautiously. "Identify yourself," a familiar voice called. "It's Calloway," Rhett replied. "With Mrs. Blackwood." Sheriff Wilson stepped forward, lowering his weapon. "Thank God, we were getting worried." "Did you run into trouble?" "Some," Rhett admitted, dismounting carefully before helping Violet down. "Blackwood suspected something. There was a confrontation." "Is he dead?" Wilson asked sharply. "No, wounded and tied up with his men about 5 miles east of his ranch near the narrow pass." Wilson nodded to one of his deputies. "Take Johnson and find them. Bring them to the jail in town." As the deputy rode off, Wilson led Rhett and Violet into the small cabin. A fire burned in the hearth, and simple provisions had been laid out on a rough-hewn table. Another deputy stood as they entered, offering his chair to Violet. "Mrs. Blackwood," Wilson said gently, "are you injured?" "No, Sheriff," she replied, sinking gratefully into the chair. "Just tired. And the baby seems all right." She placed a hand on her belly. "But I would like to see Doc Miller when possible." "Of course." Wilson turned to Rhett. "You're bleeding." Rhett glanced down at his leg where blood had soaked through his trousers. "It's just a graze. Violet needs attention more than I do." "Doc's waiting for both of you in town," Wilson assured him. "But we need to move quickly. Once Blackwood's men regroup, they'll be searching every inch of territory between here and the border." "How long until the marshal arrives?" Rhett asked, accepting a cup of coffee from the deputy. 4 days, according to the latest telegram. I've arranged for secure accommodation for Mrs. Blackwood until then." "And after?" Violet asked, her voice small. "What happens when the marshal takes Nathaniel away?" Wilson and Rhett exchanged glances. "That depends on you, Mrs. Blackwood," the sheriff said carefully. "The law recognizes your marriage regardless of the circumstances that led to it. But there are options," Rhett added, kneeling beside her chair despite the pain in his leg. "Annulment, perhaps, given the coercion involved. Or divorce, though that would take longer." "And where would I go?" she asked, her eyes searching his. "The ranch belongs to Nathaniel. Everything does. You would come with me," Rhett said without hesitation, "if that's what you want." A tentative smile, the first Rhett had seen since his return, curved her lips. "Is that a proposal, Rhett Calloway?" "The most sincere one I'll ever make," he replied, taking her hand. "I've loved you since we were hardly more than children, Violet. I never stopped, not for a single day. I want to spend the rest of my life making up for the time we lost." "And the child?" she asked, her free hand moving protectively to her belly. "Will be ours," Rhett promised. "In every way that matters." Tears spilled onto her cheeks, but her smile widened. "Then yes, yes to all of it." Sheriff Wilson cleared his throat, clearly moved by the exchange. "As touching as this is, we need to get you both to safety. My deputy will ride ahead to make sure the way is clear. We'll follow in 15 minutes. The journey to town was tense but uneventful. They avoided the main road, taking a circuitous route that added miles but reduced the risk of encountering Blackwood's men. Violet rode on a fresh horse provided by Wilson, while Rhett, despite his protests, was given another mount to avoid further strain on his injured leg. Doc Miller was waiting at his office when they arrived, the back entrance illuminated by a single lantern. He ushered them inside quickly, locking the door behind them. "Let me see that leg," he instructed Rhett, gesturing to an examination table. "Violet first," Rhett insisted. "She's exhausted and the baby is likely fine, given that she's still on her feet," Doc interrupted. "But that wound needs cleaning before infection sets in. Mrs. Blackwood can rest in the adjoining room while I tend to you." Reluctantly, Rhett complied, allowing the doctor to cut away his blood-soaked trouser leg. The bullet had carved a deep furrow along his outer thigh, painful but not dangerous provided it was properly treated. Doc worked efficiently, cleaning and bandaging the wound while Sheriff Wilson briefed them on the situation in town. "My deputies found Blackwood and his men where you left them," Wilson reported. "They're in cells now, though Blackwood's demanding a doctor for his shoulder." "Let him wait," Doc Miller said grimly, applying a final layer of bandage to Rhett's leg. "After what he's done to that poor girl, a little discomfort won't kill him." "What about his other men?" Rhett asked, wincing as he tested his weight on the injured leg. "Most scattered when word spread that Blackwood had been captured," Wilson replied. "A few of the more loyal ones are watching the jail, but they won't try anything with my deputies on guard. And the marshal sent a telegram confirming he'll be here within 4 days. Until then, you and Mrs. Blackwood need to stay out of sight." Doc Miller nodded agreement. "I've prepared rooms upstairs. My wife will look after Mrs. Blackwood's needs and I'll check on the baby regularly." "Thank you, Doc," Rhett said sincerely, "for everything." "Don't thank me yet," the doctor cautioned. "We're not out of the woods. Blackwood has friends in high places, including the territorial judge, if he manages to contact them before the marshal arrives." "He won't," Wilson assured them. "I've got men watching the telegraph office and every road out of town. No messages are getting through without my knowledge." With arrangements made for their safety, Rhett was finally allowed to see Violet. She lay on a bed in a small, clean room adjacent to the doctor's office, her eyes closed but her breathing indicating she was merely resting, not asleep. She opened her eyes as Rhett entered, extending her hand to him. "How are you feeling?" he asked, taking a seat beside the bed. "Better," she replied, her voice stronger than it had been earlier. "Doc says the baby is doing well, all things considered. That's good news." Rhett squeezed her hand gently. "Wilson says we need to stay here until the marshal arrives. It's the safest place for now." "And then what?" she asked, her eyes searching his. "Where will we go?" Rhett hadn't thought that far ahead, focused as he'd been on rescuing her from Blackwood. "Wherever you want," he said after a moment. "California, maybe, or north to Oregon Territory, somewhere we can start fresh." "What about your life, your profession?" There was no judgment in her voice, only concern. "That life is behind me," Rhett said firmly. "I took those jobs because I was drifting, searching for something I'd already found and foolishly left behind. With you, I don't need that life anymore." She smiled, though exhaustion was evident in every line of her face. "Good." "Because I want our child," she corrected herself. "Our children to know their father as the man I fell in love with, not the gunfighter others fear." "They will," he promised. "Now rest, we're safe here." As Violet drifted into sleep, Rhett maintained his vigil beside her bed, his mind turning over the events of the past few days. They had escaped Blackwood's immediate control, but the danger was far from over. Until the marshal arrived and formal charges were filed, Blackwood remained a threat. And even after, there would be legal complications regarding Violet's marriage and the ownership of property. The road ahead would not be easy, but looking at Violet's peaceful face in sleep, Rhett knew with certainty that any challenge was worth facing to secure their future together. He had been given a second chance, one he had no intention of squandering. The 4 days until the marshal's arrival passed with agonizing slowness. Rhett's leg healed gradually under Doc Miller's care, while Violet regained some of her strength and spirit with each passing day. They spent hours talking, rebuilding the connection that had been severed by years of separation, and planning for the future they hoped to create together. Sheriff Wilson visited daily, bringing news of developments in town. Blackwood, his wound treated by a less sympathetic doctor, remained in jail, his fury undiminished. Several of his associates had attempted to arrange his release, offering substantial bribes that Wilson had steadfastly refused. More concerning were rumors that a judge favorable to Blackwood was being summoned from the territorial capital. On the morning of the fourth day, as they breakfasted in Doc Miller's kitchen, the sound of approaching horses drew them to the window. A small party of riders entered the town, led by a tall man in a dust coat with a U.S. Marshal's badge prominently displayed on his chest. Marshal Cooper, Wilson confirmed as he entered the kitchen moments later, and not a moment too soon. Judge Hollister arrived on the morning stage, already asking questions about Blackwood's detention. Rhett and Violet exchanged worried glances. "Will the marshal's authority supersede the judge's?" Rhett asked. "Federal jurisdiction trumps territorial in cases of fraud and murder across territory lines," Wilson explained. "Cooper's brought warrants signed by a federal judge in Denver. Even Hollister can't override those." The confrontation at the jail occurred less than an hour later. From their vantage point in Doc Miller's upstairs window, Rhett and Violet watched as Marshal Cooper, accompanied by his deputies and Sheriff Wilson, faced off against Judge Hollister and a group of Blackwood's remaining supporters outside the jailhouse. Words were exchanged, documents presented, voices raised. For a tense moment, it seemed violence might erupt as Blackwood's men moved threateningly toward the lawman. Then Marshal Cooper's hand moved to his sidearm, his deputies following suit. The standoff ended as quickly as it had begun, with Judge Hollister backing down and Blackwood's supporters dispersing reluctantly. Sheriff Wilson appeared at Doc Miller's door an hour later, his expression relieved. "It's done," he announced. "Marshal Cooper has taken custody of Blackwood. They're leaving for Denver on tomorrow morning's stage." "What about the charges here?" Rhett asked. For what he did to Violet, Wilson's expression sobered. "That's more complicated, without Mrs. Blackwood's testimony." "I'll testify," Violet interrupted, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "About everything, the coercion into marriage, the abuse, all of it." "Are you certain?" Wilson asked gently. "It won't be easy, and there's no guarantee a territorial court will side against a man of Blackwood's standing." "I'm certain," she replied, her chin lifting with determination. "I won't live in fear of him returning someday. Our child deserves better than that." Rhett took her hand, squeezing it gently. "You won't face this alone." "There's something else," Wilson added. "Marshal Cooper brought interesting news from Denver. It seems Blackwood's operation extends beyond what we knew. They found evidence linking him to land fraud schemes in 3 territories and possibly 2 murders of competitors who refused to sell." "What does that mean for his assets here?" Rhett asked. "They'll be frozen pending investigation," Wilson explained, "including the ranch and businesses. Eventually, they'll likely be auctioned to repay his victims, but that process could take months, even years." "And my legal status?" Violet asked. "Am I still considered his wife?" "For now, yes," Wilson admitted. "But Marshal Cooper believes the evidence of coercion is strong enough to support an annulment petition. He's offered to help file the necessary papers with the federal court in Denver." The news brought both relief and uncertainty. An annulment would legally erase Violet's marriage to Blackwood, but the process would take time. Until then, they existed in a precarious state, neither fully free nor safely settled. "What would you like to do?" Rhett asked Violet that evening as they sat together on Doc Miller's porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. "I don't want to stay here," she replied after a thoughtful pause. "There are too many memories, too many of Nathaniel's associates still in positions of influence. Even with him gone, I'd never feel truly safe." "We could leave as soon as you've given your testimony," Rhett suggested. "Head west to California or north to Oregon like we discussed." Violet placed a hand on her growing belly. "The baby will come in about 4 months. I'd rather not be traveling when that happens." What about Colorado? Rhett proposed. Denver's a growing city with good doctors. And with Marshall Cooper based there, we'd have some protection if Blackwood's associates tried to cause trouble. She considered this, her expression thoughtful. Denver. Yes, that could work, at least until the baby comes and the legal matters are settled. She turned to face him, her eyes reflecting the sunset's glow. And then we decide together, Rhett said, taking her hand. Wherever we go, whatever we do it as a family. A family, she repeated, smiling softly. I like the sound of that. The following morning, they watched from Doc Miller's window as Nathaniel Blackwood, hands shackled and shoulder bandaged, was escorted to the waiting stagecoach by Marshall Cooper and his deputies. Blackwood's face was set in a mask of cold fury as he was helped into the coach. Just before the door closed, he looked up, his gaze somehow finding the window where Rhett and Violet stood. The hatred in his eyes was palpable, a silent promise of retribution that sent a chill through Rhett despite the warm morning. He can't hurt you anymore, Rhett assured Violet, drawing her away from the window as the stagecoach pulled away in a cloud of dust. I know, she replied, though the slight tremor in her voice betrayed her lingering fear, but I'll feel better when we're far from here. 2 weeks later, after Violet had given her formal testimony to a territorial prosecutor, they boarded the eastbound stage for Denver. The journey would be long and uncomfortable, especially for Violet in her condition, but Doc Miller had provided medications to ease the travel sickness and had written ahead to a colleague in Denver who would attend to her upon their arrival. Sheriff Wilson saw them off, pressing a leather pouch into Rhett's hand as they prepared to board. What's this? Rhett asked, feeling the weight of coins inside. Your reward, Wilson explained. The territorial governor had a standing bounty on information leading to Blackwood's arrest. Given your role in bringing him to justice, I argued you deserved it. I didn't do it for money, Rhett protested. I know, Wilson said with a slight smile, but you've got a family to provide for now. Consider it a stake for your new beginning. The journey to Denver took nearly a week, with overnight stops at coaching inns along the route. Despite the discomforts of travel, Violet's spirits lifted with each mile that separated them from Redemption Springs. By the time the stagecoach crested the final rise revealing Denver spread out in the valley below, she was smiling more frequently, the shadow of fear gradually receding from her eyes. They secured modest lodgings in a respectable boarding house near the city center, using part of the bounty money to pay for 3 months in advance. The landlady, Mrs. Holloway, was a widow who took a particular interest in Violet's condition, offering practical advice and maternal concern that Violet, having lost her own mother years earlier, gratefully accepted. Within days of their arrival, Marshall Cooper visited, bringing news that federal charges against Blackwood had been formally filed and a trial date set for the following month. He also brought papers for Violet to sign, initiating the annulment process. The judge believes your case is strong, Cooper assured her as she signed the documents with a shaking hand. Blackwood's other crimes have destroyed any credibility he might have had. With your testimony and the evidence of coercion, the annulment should be granted without complication. How long will it take? She asked, returning the quill to its stand. 3 months, perhaps 4, Cooper replied. Legal wheels turn slowly, I'm afraid, but in the meantime, you're safe here. Blackwood is being held without bail and his assets remain frozen. And after the trial, Rhett asked. What kind of sentence would he face? Cooper's expression turned grim. If convicted on all counts, especially the murder charges, he'll hang. The blunt assessment brought a complex mixture of emotions to Violet's face: relief, vindication, and a hint of something like pity. I don't wish for his death, she said softly. I just want him to never harm anyone again. One way or another, madam, he won't, Cooper assured her. As autumn progressed into winter, Rhett and Violet settled into a routine in Denver. Using his skills with horses, Rhett secured work at a large livery stable, where his experience and gentle way with difficult animals quickly earned him the owner's respect. Violet, despite her advancing pregnancy, took in sewing work from their landlady's social circle, her fine stitching and eye for detail bringing steady income that supplemented Rhett's wages. In the evenings, they would often walk through the growing city, marveling at the electric lights being installed along the main streets and planning for their future. They found a small church with a kind pastor who, upon hearing their story, agreed to marry them as soon as Violet's annulment was granted. "Are you certain you want to marry me before the baby comes?" Rhett asked one evening as they sat before the small fireplace in their rooms. "Some might talk." "Let them," Violet replied, her hand resting on her now prominent belly. "I've endured worse than gossip. Besides, this child deserves to be born into a family filled with love, not weighed down by concerns about propriety." "I just want what's best for you," Rhett said, covering her hand with his own. "For both of you, you are what's best for us," she assured him, leaning against his shoulder. "You always were." Blackwood's trial began in early December, drawing considerable attention from Denver's newspapers. Rhett and Violet followed the proceedings through daily reports, though neither attended the courthouse. Violet's testimony had been taken in a private deposition, sparing her the ordeal of facing Blackwood in person. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Former associates, seeking leniency for their own involvement, testified to his schemes and strong-arm tactics. Documents revealed the extent of his fraud across 3 territories. Most damning were the testimonies linking him directly to the murders of 2 ranchers who had refused his offers, including evidence that he had personally given the orders for their accidents. A week before Christmas, the jury returned their verdict, guilty on all counts. The judge, showing no mercy, sentenced Nathaniel Blackwood to hang on January 15th. The news reached Rhett and Violet as they decorated a small pine tree in their rooms, Mrs. Holloway having insisted they observe the holiday properly despite their uncertain circumstances. "It's over," Rhett said, setting down the newspaper. "Really over." Violet nodded, her expression solemn as she placed a hand-carved ornament on a branch. "I should feel relieved," she said quietly, "but mostly I feel sad for the man he could have been if greed and cruelty hadn't consumed him." Rhett moved to her side, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Your capacity for compassion amazes me after everything he put you through." "It's not compassion so much as perspective," she replied, leaning into his embrace. "His choices brought him to this end. Our choices, difficult as they've been, have brought us here together with hope for the future." She guided his hand to her belly where the baby kicked vigorously. "Feel that? That's our future, Rhett, not his shadow." The annulment was granted on January 10th, 5 days before Blackwood's scheduled execution. Marshal Cooper delivered the documents personally, congratulating them with genuine warmth. "You're a free woman now, Mrs. Harmon," he said, using Violet's maiden name for the first time since they'd met. "Free to make your own choices." "Thank you, Marshal," she replied, her eyes bright with unshed tears as she clutched the papers that represented her liberation. "For everything you've done for us." "Will you stay in Denver?" Cooper asked. Rhett and Violet exchanged glances, a silent communication born of months of planning together. "For now," Rhett answered. "At least until the baby comes and is strong enough to travel. After that, we're considering Oregon." "Good land up there," Cooper nodded approvingly. "Good future for a family." They were married 3 days later in the small church they had come to consider their own, with Mrs. Holloway, Doc Miller's Denver colleague Dr. Thompson, and Marshal Cooper serving as witnesses. The ceremony was simple but deeply meaningful, the promises they exchanged carrying the weight of all they had overcome to reach this moment. "I, Rhett Calloway, take you, Violet Harmon, to be my lawfully wedded wife," Rhett vowed, his voice steady as he held her hands in his. "To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part." Violet's voice wavered slightly as she repeated the vows, her eyes never leaving his. "I, Violet Harmon, take you, Rhett Calloway, to be my lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part." "By the authority vested in me," the pastor pronounced, "I now declare you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Their first kiss as husband and wife was gentle, reverent, a seal on promises that had been years in the making. As they turned to face their small gathering of witnesses, Rhett felt a lightness he hadn't experienced since leaving Redemption Springs 5 years earlier. The circle had closed, the wrong had been righted. Nathaniel Blackwood was executed as scheduled on January 15, 1885. Neither Rhett nor Violet attended or discussed it, choosing instead to focus on preparing for their child's arrival. The final legal matters regarding Blackwood's estate were settled in late February, with the court ruling that his properties would be auctioned to repay his victims and creditors. As Violet had been coerced into the marriage and had suffered documented abuse, she was awarded a modest settlement from the estate enough to provide a comfortable start for their new life. Their daughter, Rebecca Grace Calloway, was born on March 3, 1885, after a difficult but ultimately successful labor. She emerged with a shock of dark hair and eyes that, when they opened, revealed the same deep blue as her mother's. Rhett, who had paced anxiously outside the bedroom during the delivery, felt his heart expand impossibly as Dr. Thompson placed the tiny bundle in his arms. "She's perfect," he whispered, carefully carrying his daughter to Violet's bedside. "Look what we've done." Violet, exhausted but radiant, reached out to touch the baby's cheek. "Hello, Rebecca," she murmured. "We've been waiting for you." As spring turned the Colorado landscape green once more, the Calloways prepared for their journey west. With Rebecca thriving and Violet fully recovered from childbirth, they felt ready to embark on the next chapter of their lives. They had purchased a sturdy wagon and supplies, and Rhett had secured positions for them with a wagon train heading to Oregon Territory in early May. On their final evening in Denver, they visited Marshall Cooper to say their goodbyes and express their gratitude one last time. The lawman, who had become a friend during their months in the city, presented them with a gift, a hand-drawn map of the Oregon Territory with promising homestead areas marked in red ink. "My brother settled there 5 years ago," Cooper explained. "Says the Willamette Valley is some of the finest farming land he's ever seen. Plenty of rainfall, mild winters, good markets for produce in the growing towns." "Thank you, Marshall," Rhett said, carefully rolling the map, "for this and for everything else." "You saved yourselves," Cooper replied with a slight smile. "I just provided a little assistance along the way." He reached out to touch Rebecca's cheek gently as she slept in Violet's arms. "This little one is lucky to have parents with such courage and determination." "We're the lucky ones," Violet said softly, looking down at her daughter. "To have found our way back to each other, to have her, to have a future free from fear." The wagon train departed Denver on May 7, 1885, a long line of hopeful families making their way northwest toward new beginnings. The Calloways' wagon was near the middle of the procession, their few possessions carefully packed, Rebecca secured in a cradle Rhett had crafted himself. As the city receded behind them, Rhett and Violet sat side by side on the wagon seat, the reins of their team held confidently in Rhett's hands. Violet leaned against his shoulder, watching the landscape unfold before them. "Are you afraid?" Rhett asked, glancing down at her. "It's a long journey, and Oregon is a long way from anywhere you've ever been." "Not afraid," she replied, her smile serene. "Not as long as we're together." "Home isn't a place, Rhett. It's this you and me and Rebecca facing whatever comes our way." Rhett shifted the reins to one hand, wrapping his free arm around her shoulders. "I love you, Mrs. Calloway. And I love you, Mr. Calloway," she returned, tilting her face up for his kiss. Behind them, Rebecca stirred in her cradle, making the small, contented sounds that had become the music of their days. Ahead, the trail stretched toward the horizon, leading to a future they would build together, day by day, with the same courage and determination that had brought them through the darkest of times. As the wagon train wound its way toward the distant mountains, the past, with all its pain and regret, fell away like the dust of the trail behind them. What remained was the road ahead, a family forged in adversity, and a love that had endured separation, suffering, and the test of time, emerging stronger for all it had overcome. The cowboy who had ridden back to save his first love from a cruel man had indeed stayed to make her his wife. And in that commitment, both had found the home they had always sought, not in a place, but in each other's hearts. 10 years later, the Calloway farm in Oregon's Willamette Valley was among the most prosperous in the county. Fertile soil and abundant rainfall had blessed their efforts, transforming the initial 160-acre homestead claim into a thriving operation producing wheat, apples, and the finest horses in the region. The modest cabin they had built during that first difficult winter had given way to a comfortable 2-story farmhouse, white-painted with green shutters and a wide porch where the family gathered on summer evenings. A barn and outbuildings stood nearby, and fields stretched toward the distant mountains that cradled their valley. Rebecca, now 10 years old, had grown into a spirited girl with her mother's blue eyes and a determined character all her own. She rode fearlessly, read voraciously, and showed a natural talent for music that reminded Rhett of Violet in her youth. Though she knew the circumstances of her birth, they had agreed never to hide the truth from her. She considered Rhett her father in every way that mattered, and he had loved her as his own from her first breath. She was not an only child for long. 2 years after their arrival in Oregon, Violet had given birth to twins Daniel Edward and Elizabeth Rose, who at 8 years old were inseparable companions and occasional conspirators in childhood mischief. 3 years later came Matthew James, now 5 and determined to keep up with his older siblings in every endeavor. On this particular evening in the summer of 1895, Rhett stood on the porch, watching as Violet gathered the children from their play for supper. The setting sun gilded her chestnut hair, now threaded with the occasional strand of silver that Rhett found inexplicably beautiful. At 32, she retained the grace that had captivated him in their youth, enhanced now by the quiet confidence of a woman who had faced her darkest fears and emerged victorious. "Papa," Matthew called, breaking free from his mother's grasp to race toward the porch. "Did you see the frog I caught? He was this big." The boy spread his hands wide in the universal gesture of fishermen and frog catchers throughout history. "That's quite a frog," Rhett agreed solemnly, scooping his youngest son into his arms. "Did you let him go as we discussed?" Matthew nodded vigorously. "Back in the pond, Rebecca says frogs eat mosquitoes, so they're useful." "Rebecca is right," Rhett confirmed, setting the boy down as the rest of the family approached. "Your sister is very knowledgeable about such things." Rebecca, overhearing, lifted her chin proudly. "Mrs. Thornton at school gave me a book about amphibians. Did you know some frogs can freeze solid in winter and still survive when they thaw in spring?" "I did not know that," Rhett admitted, genuinely impressed. "Perhaps you'll be a scientist someday." "Or a doctor," Violet suggested, herding the twins up the porch steps. "Dr. Rebecca Calloway has a fine sound to it." "Maybe," Rebecca conceded, though her expression remained thoughtful, "but I also like horses like Papa." "There's time to decide," Rhett assured her, opening the door to usher his family inside. "Many years yet." The evening meal was a lively affair, as always. The children chattered about their day's adventures, lessons, and discoveries. Daniel proudly displayed a carved wooden horse he'd completed under the tutelage of Mr. Jensen, the elderly Norwegian who lived on the neighboring farm. Elizabeth announced that she had successfully read an entire chapter book without assistance, a milestone that earned her extra dessert. Matthew, not to be outdone, demonstrated his ability to count to 100 without mistake. After the meal, as was their custom, the family gathered in the parlor. Elizabeth and Daniel played a checkers game by the fireplace while Matthew built elaborate structures with wooden blocks. Rebecca, curled in a chair by the window, lost herself in her latest book. Violet sat at the piano, her fingers moving gracefully over the keys as she played the melodies that had been part of their lives for as long as the children could remember. Rhett, watching his family from his favorite armchair, felt the familiar swell of gratitude that came in these quiet moments. The journey from that blood-red sunset in Redemption Springs to this peaceful evening had been long and not without challenges, but every step had led them here, to this life they had built together. Later, with the children tucked into bed and the house settled into nighttime silence, Rhett and Violet stood on the porch, gazing at the stars that spangled the clear Oregon sky. His arm around her waist, her head on his shoulder, they savored the moment of quiet togetherness that bookended their busy days. "I had a letter from Marshall Cooper today," Rhett said softly. "He's retiring next month, moving to San Francisco to live with his daughter." "After all these years," Violet mused, "it's hard to imagine him without that badge. He asked after you and Rebecca, says he still has that photograph we sent of the whole family last Christmas." Violet smiled at the thought. "We should invite him to visit. The children would love his stories, and we owe him so much." "We do," Rhett agreed, "though he'd say, as he always does, that we saved ourselves." "Perhaps we both played our parts," Violet suggested, turning in his arms to face him. "You, me, the Marshal, Doc Miller, Sheriff Wilson. Even Nathaniel in his way." Rhett's brow furrowed at the mention of Blackwood's name. "How do you mean?" "His cruelty forced me to find strength I didn't know I possessed," she explained, her voice contemplative. "Without that, I might never have become the woman I am now, the woman who could build this life with you, raise these children, face whatever comes our way." Rhett studied her face in the moonlight, marveling at her wisdom and the depth of her understanding. "You always could see the lesson in the hardship," he said, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "It's one of the countless reasons I love you." "And what are the others?" she asked, her eyes twinkling with the playfulness that had returned to her over the years. "Well now," he drawled, pulling her closer, "that would take all night to list properly." "We have time," she reminded him, rising on tiptoe to press her lips to his. "All the time in the world." As they stood together under the vast canopy of stars, the house behind them sheltering the children who were their legacy, Rhett reflected on the long, winding path that had led them here. From first love to separation, from desperation to rescue, from healing to building this life rich with purpose and joy, every step had been necessary. Every challenge overcome had strengthened the bond between them. The cowboy who had ridden back to save his first love had indeed stayed to make her his wife. But in the staying, in the building of this life together, he had discovered a truth he hadn't expected. In saving her, he had also saved himself. And together, they had created something neither could have achieved alone: a family, a home, a future built on the unshakable foundation of a love that had endured the worst and emerged triumphant. "All the time in the world," Rhett echoed, his arms tightening around her as if to protect this precious moment from the relentless flow of time. "And it still wouldn't be enough." Violet's smile, luminous in the moonlight, was the same one that had captured his heart all those years ago in a small town under the Arizona sun. "Then we'll just have to make the most of every moment we're given," she said softly, "starting with this one." And as their lips met once more under the stars, the promise of tomorrow stretching before them like the vast Oregon sky, they did exactly that.